I tell you this now because there is no one left who would believe me, and because the words have sat like shrapnel in my throat for so long that I fear they will kill me if I don't expel them. My name was Torven Krell, and I was a tank mechanic in the 304th Armored Regiment of the Imperial Guard. That word carries more weight than any wrench I ever lifted, more finality than any engine I ever silenced. I say was because the man who bore that name died on Gren II, though his body continued to perform its duties for 3 more years. I say was because what I became in those trenches, in that perpetual thunder of artillery and the screaming of wounded metal, bore only the faintest resemblance to the idealistic fool who had volunteered for mechanized support duty, thinking he would serve the Emperor from behind the lines. The smell hits me first when I close my eyes. Even now in this Medicae ward where they tell me I am safe, where the chirurgeon servitors glide past on silent tracks and the recycled air tastes of nothing but antiseptic and filtered patients, it is the smell of promethium mixed with human sweat, of oil that has been heated past its tolerances, of burned rubber and scorched paint, and the particular copper and iron stench of blood that has soaked into soil and been churned by tank treads until it becomes part of the earth itself. That smell defined my existence for so long that clean air felt like a lie, an insult to the dead whose fluids had seasoned every breath I took. I would wake in my cot, those rare times when we were rotated back far enough from the front to have cots, instead of sleeping beneath the tanks we served, and smell it on my skin, in my hair, ground so deep into my pores that no amount of scrubbing with harsh lye soap could eradicate it. The other men in my detail smelled the same. We were marked by our trade, as surely as if the Emperor himself had branded us with hot iron. Gren II was not supposed to be a difficult campaign. That is what the commissars told us when we made Planetfall. What the voxcasters repeated in between the patriotic hymns and the mandatory prayer cycles. The enemy was described as poorly equipped cultists, their armor outdated, their faith weak. We would crush them beneath the treads of righteousness, they said, the Emperor's will made manifest in blessed steel. I believed them because I was young, because I had completed my training at the Munitorum depot on Calth's secondary moon and thought I understood what war meant. I had stripped engines, diagnosed transmission failures, replaced bogey wheels on Mark IV Leman Russ battle tanks in the controlled environment of the training yard. I had scored in the upper percentile on my technical examinations. I had received a commendation for completing a full engine overhaul in record time. I was competent, certified, and utterly unprepared for the reality that awaited us in the mud. The mud of Gren VII was not like the earth I had known on my hive world birth level. It was black and thick as tar, mixed with the ash of burned forests and the pulverized stone of destroyed settlements. It clung to everything. It filled the tracks of our tanks, adding tons of dead weight that strained the engines and transmission systems. It splattered across vision blocks and periscopes, blinding our crews. It crept into air intakes and fouled filtration systems. And it never, ever dried. The rain on that world fell in sheets, cold and relentless, turning the battlefield into a morass that swallowed wounded men and disabled vehicles with equal indifference. I spent my first week on Gren VII learning to walk in mud that reached my knees, learning to work while standing in freezing water that seeped through even-sealed boots, learning that the technical manuals I had memorized made no provisions for repairing a tank's road wheels, while enemy artillery walked steadily closer, and the driver screamed at you to hurry because the squadron was moving up, and if we were left behind, we were dead. My detail consisted of 12 men initially. There was Sergeant Voss, a veteran of 4 campaigns who had a scar across his throat from a shrapnel wound that had somehow missed his jugular. He rarely spoke above a whisper, but when he did, we listened, because he had kept mechanics alive in situations where the manuals said it could not be done. There was Halleck, who had been a forge worker before conscription and could identify an engine problem by sound alone, his ear pressed to the hull, while shells burst close enough to pepper us with dirt. There was young Pym, barely 17 standard years, whose small hands made him invaluable for reaching into tight spaces in the engine compartment. There was Gorvus, who never smiled and kept a tally of tanks we had returned to service carved into the stock of his lasgun. There were 8 others whose names and faces have blurred together in memory, not because they were unmemorable but because I have worked so hard to forget them, to bury them as surely as the mud of Gren VII buried their bodies. We were attached to the 3rd Squadron. 8 Leman Russ battle tanks commanded by Captain Drent, a man whose face I saw perhaps 3 times in total, and whose voice I knew only as a distorted rasp over the vox, demanding to know when his tanks would be operational again. Our job was simple in theory: keep the tanks moving. When a track threw a link, we replaced it. When an engine overheated, we stripped it down and rebuilt it. When a shell punctured a fuel tank, we patched it and refilled it from the promethium bosers that followed the regiment. When a tank crew died, we cleaned out the interior before the next crew took position. That last duty was never mentioned in training, but it became as routine as checking fluid levels. The manuals said nothing about scraping burned flesh from control stations or removing pieces of a gunner from the breech mechanism. They said nothing about the sounds a tank makes when the crew is killed, but the engine still runs, that peculiar rattling hum of a machine waiting for orders that will never come. The first tank I saw destroyed was Hammer of Piety, 3rd Squadron's command vehicle. We were in a defensive position along a ridgeline, hull down behind earthworks, that had been thrown up by the regiment's engineer servitors. The enemy had been probing our lines for 3 days, with infantry and light vehicles, testing for weak points. Captain Drent had positioned his squadron to provide overlapping fields of fire across the approach valley, a textbook deployment that should have turned any assault into a killing field. I was performing routine maintenance on Righteous Fury, 3rd Squadron's 2nd tank, tightening the bolts on a replaced road wheel. The sound of the explosion reached me before the shockwave, a crack so loud it felt like being struck in the chest. I looked up to see Hammer of Piety obscured by a column of black smoke shot through with orange flame. The turret lay 10 meters from the hull, blown clear by the catastrophic detonation of its ammunition store. The smell of cooking meat reached me seconds later. Sergeant Voss appeared at my side, his scarred throat working soundlessly for a moment before his whisper emerged. "Artillery. Heavy caliber. They have our range." He was already moving, dragging me away from Righteous Fury toward the trench line we had dug beside our maintenance area. The rest of the detail was scrambling, grabbing tools and essential parts, abandoning the heavy equipment we could not carry. The second shell landed where I had been standing, destroying Righteous Fury's left track assembly and gouging a crater deep enough to swallow a man. I remember thinking, with perfect clarity, that I had just tightened those bolts, that the work had been done correctly, efficiently, and now it meant nothing. That shell was followed by a dozen more, then 100, then a bombardment so sustained that individual explosions ceased to be distinguishable and became instead a continuous roar that vibrated in my bones and made my teeth ache. We spent 6 hours in that trench while the enemy artillery systematically destroyed 3rd Squadron's position. The tanks tried to move, to relocate before they were bracketed and destroyed, but the ground we had thought solid revealed itself to be treacherous. Emperor's Vengeance threw a track attempting to reverse and had to be abandoned. Faithful Servant took a direct hit to its engine compartment and burned for 3 hours, the ammunition inside cooking off in sporadic secondary explosions. Stalwart's crew made it 50 meters before a shell landed directly on the turret, crushing it like a tin cup under a boot heel. I watched this from the trench, my face pressed into mud that tasted of chemicals and rot, while fragments of blessed steel rained down around us, and Sergeant Voss held the back of my head with one calloused hand to keep me from raising it and losing it to shrapnel. When the barrage finally ceased, 3 of 3rd Squadron's 8 tanks were total losses. 2 more were damaged beyond field repair. The remaining 3 were intact but low on ammunition and nearly out of fuel. Our detail had lost 2 men. Servak, killed by a shell fragment that had nearly bisected him, and Tolm, who had been standing too close to Emperor's vengeance when it exploded and had been crushed by a section of falling armor plate. We buried them in a shell crater after dark, using our entrenching tools to hack at soil hardened by the heat of explosions. No prayers were said. Sergeant Voss simply marked the location on his data slate so it could be reported to the regimental quartermaster for casualty documentation. Then we went back to work because the 3 surviving tanks needed to be refueled and rearmed before dawn, and the 2 damaged ones needed to be assessed for salvage. I learned something in that first bombardment that the training cadre had never taught me. Tanks are not just machines, they are tombs waiting to be sealed. Every time I climbed onto a hull after that, every time I opened an engine compartment or crawled beneath a chassis, I was intimately aware that I was working on something designed to be destroyed, something that existed only to absorb punishment until it could absorb no more. The armor that protected the crew was barely sufficient against the weapons the enemy deployed. A well-placed shot could penetrate the frontal glacis. A hit to the side or rear was almost always catastrophic. The fuel tanks were vulnerable. The ammunition stores were vulnerable. The vision blocks, the hatches, the engine grills, the track assemblies, everything was vulnerable. And when a tank died, it died violently, turning from a blessed instrument of the Emperor's will into a furnace that cremated the men inside in seconds. But we kept them running. That was our purpose, our duty, our only value to the regiment. When a tank broke down, we swarmed it like carrion insects on a corpse, tearing out damaged components and replacing them with spares cannibalized from destroyed vehicles. When ammunition ran low, we formed chains and passed shells hand to hand from the supply trucks to the tanks, working through the night with only lumens for light, because showing anything brighter would draw enemy fire. When fuel was scarce, we siphoned it from wrecks, filtering it through rags to remove contamination before pumping it into tanks that would burn it all within hours. We worked until our hands bled, until our backs spasmed, until we could no longer feel our feet in the freezing mud. And then we worked more, because the alternative was death. The enemy counterattacked at dawn, 3 days after the first bombardment. They came in waves. Cultist infantry supported by corrupted vehicles that bore twisted versions of Imperial designs. Their tanks were older models, yes, but they had been modified, festooned with blasphemous symbols and strange protrusions that might have been weapons or simply decorations meant to inspire terror. They worked. I was beneath Justice Prevails, replacing a damaged fuel line, when the Voxcaster in Sergeant Voss's hand crackled to life, with the order to clear the area immediately. I barely had time to grab my tools before Justice Prevails's engine roared to full power, and the tank lurched forward, nearly crushing me. I rolled into a shell crater and pressed myself flat as the tank rumbled past, its treads close enough that I could see the individual track links and the mud packed between them. The battle lasted 4 hours. I experienced it as sound and fury filtered through mud and terror. The crack of the Leman Russ battle cannons firing, the higher-pitched bark of autocannons and heavy bolters, the scream of incoming shells, and the crump of their detonations, the rattle of small arms fire like rain on a tin roof, and beneath it all, the omnipresent growl of engines pushed to their limits, transmissions grinding, exhausts belching black smoke. I learned to distinguish the sounds of different weapons, to recognize when a tank's gun had jammed by the cessation of its firing pattern, to identify which vehicle had been hit by the change in its engine note. I became a student of mechanical agony, capable of diagnosing a tank's distress from 100 meters away, based solely on the sounds it made as it died. When the enemy withdrew, 3rd Squadron had 1 tank left operational. Justice Prevails sat at the center of our position, its armor scorched and pitted, its right track damaged, its main gun barrel slightly bent from a near miss that should have destroyed it entirely. The crew emerged from the hatches, their faces black with powder smoke, their movements jerky with combat stims and adrenaline crash. The tank commander, a lieutenant whose name I never learned, looked at me with eyes that seemed to contain nothing but static and said, "Fix it." Then he collapsed beside the hull and did not move for 6 hours. We fixed it. Sergeant Voss led us in a scavenging expedition across the battlefield, stepping over and sometimes on the bodies of the dead ours and theirs to reach the wrecks of destroyed vehicles. We took what we needed: track links from one, a machine gun mount from another, filters and gaskets and seals from a third. Halleck and I removed the main gun from a tank whose turret had been torn open by an internal explosion, wrestling the massive barrel free and transporting it on an improvised sled made from hull plates. It took us 9 hours to install it, working by the light of portable lumens while sentries watched the darkness beyond our perimeter and occasionally fired at shadows. Young Pym lost 2 fingers to a slipped wrench, the digits crushed beyond any hope of reattachment. He stared at the ruined hand for perhaps 10 seconds, then wrapped it in a rag and went back to work, because we needed him to reach into the turret mechanism and we had no replacement for small hands. The regiment pulled us back to a secondary defensive line the next day. 3rd Squadron, once 8 tanks strong, now consisted of Justice Prevails and a mismatched collection of parts that might someday be assembled into operational vehicles if we could find the time and components. Our detail was down to 9 men. We were consolidated with survivors from other squadrons' maintenance teams, forming a pool of mechanics assigned to keep the entire regiment's armor functional. There were perhaps 40 of us in total, drawn from 12 different squads, united only by our trade and our exhaustion. We were given a sector of the defensive line to call our own, a stretch of trenches and dugouts near the regimental maintenance depot where the heavy equipment and spare parts were stored. We called it the pit, and it became the center of my existence for the next 3 years. The pit was a scar in the earth perhaps 200 meters long and 50 wide, originally a natural depression that had been expanded by explosions and excavation until it resembled a wound in the world's flesh. At one end sat the depot, a collection of semi-buried cargo containers and prefabricated bunkers where the regiment's technical supplies were stored. At the other end was the scrapyard, where destroyed vehicles were dragged to be stripped for parts. Between them lay our workspace, an open area where tanks could be driven in for repair. Trenches ringed the pit, connecting it to the regiment's defensive network. Above us, the sky was perpetually grey, and the rain fell without end, and the sound of distant artillery never quite stopped. We worked in shifts that bore no relation to standard chronology. When a tank needed repair, we repaired it, whether that meant working for 6 hours or 60. We slept when we could, usually in the maintenance bunker, a reinforced dugout that smelled of machine oil and unwashed bodies. We ate whatever the regimental supply servitors delivered, usually corpse starch rations rendered vaguely palatable by the addition of reclaimed protein paste and vitamin supplements. We prayed when the ecclesiarchy representatives made their rounds, mechanically reciting the approved litanies while our minds catalogued the work still to be done. And we learned to ignore the sounds of men dying, because the Medicae tents were positioned just beyond the pit's northern edge, and the screams carried clearly in the cold air. I was reassigned to a new sergeant, a man named Kral, who had been a tank commander before an injury left him unable to fit into a turret. His left arm ended at the elbow, the stump capped with a crude augmetic that could grip tools but lacked fine motor control. He compensated by being twice as demanding as Sergeant Voss had been, driving us to work faster, to improvise more aggressively, to accept no excuses for failure. Under his leadership, our detail developed a reputation for miracles. We returned tanks to service that by all rights should have been written off as total losses. We fabricated parts from scrap when the supply chain failed. We performed field modifications that the tech priests would have declared heretical had they bothered to inspect our work. We kept the regiment's armor moving through sheer bloody-minded refusal to admit defeat, but the cost accumulated. Gorvus was killed when a damaged fuel tank he was welding suddenly ignited, immolating him in a flash of promethium fire. Young Pym, already missing 2 fingers, lost his left hand entirely when it was crushed between a hull plate and a tread assembly. He continued to work one-handed until an infection took root and the Medicae were forced to amputate at the shoulder. He was discharged from service and I never learned what became of him, whether he lived or died, whether he found peace or simply ceased. Halleck developed a cough that grew steadily worse until he was spitting blood with every breath, his lungs destroyed by years of inhaling exhaust fumes and particulate matter. He worked until he physically could not stand, then was carried to the Medicae tent and did not return. New men arrived to replace them, fresh from depot training or reassigned from decimated units. They had names and faces and stories, and I forced myself not to learn them because learning meant attachment and attachment meant grief. The nature of the war changed around us, though in the pit we experienced it only through the condition of the tanks we serviced. The enemy grew more sophisticated, deploying weapons that struck with surgical precision rather than massed firepower. We began seeing tanks return with damage patterns that suggested focused targeting, fire control systems destroyed, engine governors shot away, vision blocks systematically eliminated. Crews returned shaken, reporting enemy infantry that moved with unnatural coordination and vehicles that seemed to anticipate their maneuvers. The commissars executed 2 men for spreading defeatist rumors. Their bodies hung from the depot's entrance as a reminder that doubt was treason. We kept working. Then came the order that changed everything. It arrived via encrypted Vox transmission, delivered personally by a tech priest I had never seen before, an emaciated figure whose augmetics outnumbered his remaining organic components. Sergeant Kral was summoned to receive it, and when he returned, his face, usually set in an expression of perpetual irritation, showed something close to fear. He gathered our detail in the maintenance bunker and told us that we had been selected for a special assignment. We were to modify a tank, Justice Prevails, specifically, incorporating experimental technology provided by the Adeptus Mechanicus. The modifications would enhance the vehicle's performance significantly, but required precise installation and calibration. We would work under the direct supervision of the tech priest. We would not discuss the modifications with anyone outside our detail. Failure to complete the work successfully would result in disciplinary action up to and including summary execution. The technology arrived the next day in sealed containers bearing the cogwheel symbol of the Mechanicus and warning labels I could not read. The tech priest, who never provided a name and whom we simply called the Magos, oversaw the unpacking personally. Inside were components that hurt to look at, devices whose function I could not begin to guess. There were cylinders of dense metal inscribed with formulae in a script I did not recognize. There were cables that seemed to writhe when no one was watching them directly. There were junction boxes that hummed with a frequency that made my teeth ache. And there was a device, roughly the size of a man's torso, that the Magos handled with reverent care and absolute terror. We worked for 5 days straight, installing the modifications. The Magos directed our every move, his mechanical voice devoid of inflection as he issued instructions in a mixture of low Gothic and binary cant. We removed Justice Prevails's existing engine control systems and replaced them with the devices from the sealed containers. We ran the strange cables through the tank's infrastructure, connecting them to systems that should have been incompatible. We installed the torso-sized device in the hull, mounting it where the ammunition storage had been, and relocating the shells to external racks welded to the rear deck. The Magos performed the final connections himself, his mechadendrites interfacing directly with the device, while he chanted in machine code and anointed the connections with blessed oil. When the modifications were complete, the Magos ordered us to clear the area. He spent an hour alone with Justice Prevails, the hatch sealed, the engine silent. When he emerged, his mechadendrites were retracted, and his posture suggested exhaustion. Though whether a being so thoroughly mechanized could experience fatigue, I could not say. He informed Sergeant Kral that the tank was now operational and should be crewed by volunteers only, as the modifications carried significant risk. When Kral asked what kind of risk, the Magos simply turned and walked away, his servo harness clicking softly in the rain. Justice Prevails's new crew consisted entirely of veterans from other destroyed tanks, men who had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. They took their positions and fired up the engine, and the sound it made was wrong. Not broken, not malfunctioning, but wrong in a way that bypassed rational analysis and spoke directly to some primal instinct. The engine note was too smooth, too perfect, lacking the characteristic roughness of a mechanical system. It sounded almost organic, like breathing, like a heartbeat. The crew emerged 15 minutes later, their faces pale, and reported that the controls responded before they touched them, that the tank seemed to anticipate their intentions. The commander, a grizzled lieutenant named Vaughn, said it felt like riding an animal rather than driving a machine. He said it felt alive. They took Justice Prevails into combat the next day, and it performed beyond any reasonable expectation. The tank moved with preternatural agility, dodging incoming fire that should have struck home. Its targeting systems achieved hit ratios that were statistically impossible. It destroyed 7 enemy vehicles in 4 hours, suffering no damage. The crew returned ecstatic, praising the Emperor and the Omnissiah and whatever genius had created the modifications. They took the tank out again the next day, and the day after, and their kill count climbed to 20, then 30, then 50. Justice Prevails became a legend within the regiment, a blessed instrument whose very presence ensured victory. And then, on the 13th day after the modifications, Lieutenant Vaughn came to the pit and asked to speak with Sergeant Kral privately. I was close enough to overhear, performing maintenance on a personnel carrier whose suspension had collapsed. Vaughn's voice was quiet, strained, as he explained that the tank was doing things they did not command it to do, that it had fired on an enemy position before they had acquired the target, that it had driven around obstacles they had not yet seen, that it seemed to know what they were thinking. He asked, very carefully, whether the modifications might be having side effects. Sergeant Kroll told him that such concerns should be directed to the tech priests. Vaughn nodded and walked away, and 3 days later his entire crew was found dead in the tank, their faces frozen in expressions of terminal fear, their bodies unmarked. The Medicae could determine no cause of death. A new crew was assigned to Justice Prevails. They lasted 4 days, before 2 of them deserted, and the other 3 requested transfer to infantry duty, claiming the tank was haunted. A 3rd crew was drafted involuntarily. They survived a week before the commander put his las pistol in his mouth and fired, and the remaining crew members had to be restrained to prevent them from doing the same. The Megos returned, performed diagnostics that revealed nothing abnormal, and declared the tank fit for service. A 4th crew was assembled, this time consisting of men who had been convicted of minor infractions and given a choice between execution and tank duty. They accepted the latter and climbed into Justice Prevails with the resignation of the condemned. This crew survived. They returned from each mission alive, if not entirely sane, their performance adequate, if not exceptional. They did not speak of what happened inside the tank, and we did not ask, but I saw them sometimes, in the moments between sorties, sitting beside the hull with the 1,000-meter stare of men who had seen something they could not unsee. And I heard the tank at night, when the fighting paused and the pit grew quiet. It idled in the scrapyard, its engine running without crew, producing that too perfect breathing sound that raised every hair on my body. Once, I approached it in the darkness, drawn by morbid curiosity and the need to understand what we had created. I placed my hand on the hull, and the metal was warm, far warmer than any engine could make it, and I felt a vibration that was not mechanical but muscular, like pressing my palm to the flank of a laboring beast. I stepped back and did not approach Justice Prevails again. The campaign ground on. We lost ground slowly, trading kilometers for time, falling back to new defensive lines that were hastily prepared and quickly overrun. The enemy adapted to our tactics, learned our patterns, exploited our weaknesses. More experimental modifications arrived from the Mechanicus. More tanks received the treatment. More crews went mad or died or simply disappeared. And we kept working because that was what we did, what we were. Our identity reduced to the tools in our hands and the stink of promethium on our skin. I noticed changes in myself, though I lacked the perspective to understand them fully. My hands no longer shook when I worked, even when shells landed close enough to shower me with debris. I felt nothing when men I had worked beside died, their deaths registering only as logistical problems that affected our manpower. I stopped counting days, and instead measured time by the number of tanks serviced, by the liters of blood cleaned from crew compartments, by the weight of parts scavenged from the dead. I forgot what it felt like to be warm, to be dry, to be anything other than exhausted. I forgot what it felt like to hope. Sergeant Kral fell during an enemy breakthrough, crushed beneath the tracks of our own tank when the driver panicked and reversed into our position. His death was so prosaic, so mundane, that it barely registered. I inherited his position by virtue of being the longest-serving member of the detail, a promotion that came with no ceremony, no recognition, no increase in rations. I simply began giving orders instead of receiving them, and the men obeyed, because that was how the system functioned. I was responsible for keeping them alive, for distributing assignments, for making impossible decisions about which tanks received priority when we lacked resources to service all of them. I was 23 standard years old and felt ancient. The modified tanks accumulated. By the end of the second year on Gren II, the regiment fielded 17 vehicles equipped with the Mechanicus technology. They were devastatingly effective in combat, their kill ratios dwarfing those of conventional tanks. They were also deadly to their crews. The average survival time for a crew assigned to a modified tank was 47 days. Some crews lasted longer, growing gaunt and hollow-eyed but functional. Others broke within hours, their minds unable to withstand whatever the tanks did to them. The tech priests insisted this was acceptable attrition, that the tactical advantages outweighed the human costs. The regimental commander, a colonel I glimpsed exactly once during my entire deployment, apparently agreed. The modifications continued. I should have questioned this. I should have recognized that we were crossing lines that should not be crossed, that we were complicit in something fundamentally wrong. But I did not, because questioning required energy I no longer possessed, and because the alternative to the modified tanks was conventional armor that died just as surely but achieved far less. The equation was simple. The modified tanks won battles. Winning battles kept the regiment alive. Keeping the regiment alive kept us alive. Everything else was irrelevant. I told myself this, and I believed it, because belief was easier than doubt. The enemy launched their final offensive in the third year of the campaign. It was not a subtle assault, but a massed attack along the entire front. Thousands of corrupted infantry supported by hundreds of vehicles, all driving toward the regimental headquarters with singular purpose. We were ordered to hold at any cost, to buy time for reinforcements that might or might not arrive. The pit became a fortress, its trenches packed with infantry, its approaches seeded with mines, its airspace covered by flak guns that fired until their barrels glowed. Every functional tank, modified or otherwise, was deployed to the defensive line. Every mechanic who could hold a lasgun was issued one and assigned a firing position. We were told that victory was certain, that the Emperor himself watched over us, that our sacrifice would be remembered. We knew this was a lie, but we took our positions anyway because there was nowhere else to go. The battle began at dawn and did not stop. The enemy came in waves that broke against our lines and reformed and came again, accepting casualties that would have shattered any sane force. Our tanks fired until their ammunition was exhausted, fell back to rearm, and returned to the line. The modified tanks fought with inhuman precision, cutting through enemy formations like chainswords through flesh. But there were too many enemies, and too few of us, and slowly, inevitably, the line contracted. I killed my first man during that battle. An enemy soldier breached the trench line, his uniform a patchwork of stolen Imperial gear and blasphemous markings. His face twisted into a rictus that might have been rage or ecstasy or madness. He came at me with a crude blade, while I was attempting to replace a severed fuel line on a tank, and I hit him with the wrench I was holding. The wrench was heavy, designed for removing track pins, and it caved in his skull with a sound like breaking pottery. He fell, and I stepped over him and continued working because the tank needed to return to service. I felt nothing. I was nothing. I was a tool in the Emperor's hand, and tools do not require emotions. The modified tanks began to fail on the third day of the battle. Not mechanically, their systems remained functional, but the crews could no longer operate them. We found Justice Prevails abandoned, its engine running, its weapons loaded, the crew gone. We never determined where they went, or why. Other modified tanks suffered similar fates. Crews that deserted, that killed each other, that simply stopped responding to orders and had to be extracted by force. The tech priests tried to requisition new crews, but we had run out of men willing or able to endure the tank's influence. The modified vehicles sat idle, while conventional tanks burned and died around them, perfect killing machines rendered useless by the fragility of human minds. On the fifth day, the enemy breached the pit's perimeter. They poured into our sanctuary like filthy water into a broken dam, and we fought them with tools and wrenches and improvised weapons, because most of us had expended our lasgun ammunition days earlier. I remember beating a man to death with a track tensioner, the heavy tool rising and falling until my arms burned and his body stopped moving. I remember the smell of blood so thick it coated my throat. I remember Halleck, no, not Halleck. He was already dead. Someone else whose name I cannot recall being dragged into a group of enemies and torn apart while he screamed, and I remember thinking only that we would need to find a replacement for his position. The reinforcements arrived on the sixth day, a full regiment of fresh troops with air support and artillery and supplies we had not seen in months. They drove the enemy back, reclaimed the pit, secured the area. They found perhaps 80 survivors from our original regimental strength of 3,000. I was among them, standing in waist-deep water in a collapsed trench, still holding a piece of machinery I had been using as a weapon, unable to remember the last time I had slept or eaten or felt anything approximating human emotion. They pulled me out and took me to the Medicae, and I tried to explain that I needed to return to work, that there were tanks that required servicing, that my duty was not complete. They sedated me, and when I woke, I was on a transport lifting off from Gren II, the world's surface disappearing beneath me, like a nightmare fading in daylight. I spent 6 months in a Medicae facility being treated for what the chirurgeons called acute stress disorder and chronic exposure to combat conditions. They repaired my body, the malnutrition, the chemical burns, the minor fractures that had healed incorrectly, the lung damage from prolonged inhalation of toxic fumes. They could not repair my mind. I would wake screaming from dreams where I was buried beneath tank treads, would panic at the sound of engines, would smell promethium when there was none. They tried various therapies, various medications, various interventions. Nothing worked, because the problem was not chemical or neurological but existential. I had spent 3 years becoming something less than human, and the process was not reversible. Eventually, they discharged me. I was given a medical exemption from further combat service, a small pension, and discharge papers that classified me as unfit for continued military duty. I was 26 standard years old, and felt like I had lived a dozen lifetimes. I tried to return to civilian life, to find work in a manufactorum or repair shop, to rebuild some semblance of normal existence. I lasted 3 weeks before I requested reassignment to a mechanized unit. The Munitorum, in its infinite bureaucratic wisdom, granted my request and sent me to a rear echelon maintenance depot, where I now service vehicles for units deploying to active war zones. I am good at my job. I am efficient, thorough, capable of diagnosing and repairing complex mechanical problems with minimal resources. I train new mechanics, passing on the skills I learned in the pit, teaching them how to work under pressure, how to improvise, how to keep machines running past the point where they should fail. I do not tell them what those skills cost me. I do not tell them about Gren II, about the modified tanks, about the weight of being the one who decides which vehicle gets repaired and which gets abandoned. I do not tell them that every engine I service sounds like breathing, that every fuel line I replace feels warm like flesh, that I sometimes catch myself speaking to the machines as if they could understand. The nightmares have not stopped. I dream of the pit almost every night, of working in endless rain while shells fall and men scream and the tanks wait patiently to be fed. I dream of justice prevails, its engine idling in the darkness, that terrible breathing sound filling the air. I dream of the device the Magos installed, and in my dreams I understand what it was, what we did when we incorporated it into the tank's systems. But when I wake, the understanding slips away, leaving only dread. I received a commendation recently for my service on Gren II, a small piece of brass shaped into the Aquila, presented by a commissar who read from a script praising my dedication, my technical skill, my unwavering service to the Emperor. He pinned it to my uniform and said I was a credit to the Imperium. I thanked him and saluted and felt nothing, because the thing that could have felt pride or satisfaction or even relief died in the mud 3 years ago. What remains is a machine wearing human skin, performing its function because that is what it was built to do. Sometimes I wonder what happened to Justice Prevails, whether it still functions, still fights, still breathes in the darkness, whether it misses its crews, if a thing like that can miss anything, whether it dreams, and if so, what nightmares haunt a mind that exists in steel rather than flesh. I tell myself these are foolish thoughts, that tanks are machines and nothing more, that the modifications were simply advanced technology I lacked the education to understand. I tell myself this, and I do not believe it, because I felt that tank's heartbeat beneath my palm, and I know what we created. The other mechanics here sometimes ask me about my time at the front. They want stories, tales of heroism and sacrifice, narratives that fit the approved patterns of imperial propaganda. I tell them nothing useful. I describe routine maintenance procedures, discuss technical specifications, provide dry analysis of mechanical systems. I do not tell them about the smell, about the sounds, about the crushing weight of knowing that your best work, your finest achievement, your most skillful repair only returns a crew to their deaths a few hours sooner. I do not tell them that I can no longer distinguish between the sound of tank engines and the sound of breathing, that I sometimes find myself holding tools I do not remember picking up, that I wake with my hands moving through phantom repair procedures. I am writing this because I need to expel it, to lance it like an infected wound before it poisons me completely. I am writing this because no one else will remember what happened in the pit, what we did there, what we became. The official records list Gren II as a victory, a successful defense against heretical insurgents. They make no mention of the modified tanks, of the crews that went mad, of the price we paid for weapons that worked too well. The Mechanicus has undoubtedly moved on to new experiments, new modifications, new ways to enhance the Imperium's war machines at the cost of the humans who operate them. And mechanics like me continue to service those machines, installing components we do not understand, following instructions that violate every principle of safe engineering, because we are told to, and because refusal means death. I do not know if what we did was heresy. I lack the theological education to make that determination. I know only that it felt wrong in a way that transcended technical concerns, that it required us to treat tanks as if they were alive and crews as if they were disposable, and that the result was effective but not righteous. I know that I am complicit, that my hands installed the modifications, that my skills enabled the program to function. I know that I would do it again if ordered, because I am too broken to refuse, too damaged to rebel, too empty to care about anything beyond the next repair, the next service cycle, the next tank that needs my attention. The smell of promethium never entirely fades. Even here, in this clean facility with its proper ventilation and regulated atmosphere, I catch whiffs of it, imagined or remembered, or somehow clinging to me at a molecular level. It reminds me of the pit, of the rain and the mud and the endless work. It reminds me of what I was and what I became and what I can never again be. It reminds me that I survived when better men died, and that survival was not mercy but punishment, A sentence to carry the weight of those years until my body finally fails and grants me the peace of oblivion. I tell you this now, in this written confession, because speaking it aloud would invite interrogation and censure and possibly execution. I tell you this knowing that these words will likely never be read, that they exist only to give shape to the things I cannot forget. I tell you this because I am Torven Krell, and I was a tank mechanic in the 304th Armored Regiment, and I served in the pit on Gren II for 3 years, and that service hollowed me out and filled the empty space with oil and blood and the memory of engines that breathed like living things. And I tell you this because somewhere, on some battlefield I will never see, justice prevails, still fights, still kills, still waits for a crew that can withstand what it has become, and when I close my eyes, I can hear it calling, that perfect engine note that sounds like breathing, like heartbeat, like hunger. It calls, and part of me, the part that died in the mud, the part that learned to find comfort in the presence of machines, because machines do not die like men die, wants to answer. But I am here, and it is there, and the distance between us is measured in light years and trauma, and the weight of choices that cannot be unmade. I service the tanks that come to my depot. I train the mechanics who will replace me. I perform my duty with the precision of a servitor and the emptiness of a man who burned out everything soft and warm and human in the fires of a war that had no meaning beyond survival. This is what I learned in the pit, that duty is not noble, that sacrifice is not redemptive, that service to the Emperor is indistinguishable from service to a machine that cares nothing for your suffering. I learned that humans are fragile and machines are patient, and somewhere in between lies a horror that wears the shape of both. I learned that you can survive anything if you are willing to stop being human, and that once you make that choice, there is no path back. I am Torven Krell. I was a tank mechanic. I am something else now, something that wears my name and performs my function but lacks my soul. And when I dream, which is always, I am back in the pit, standing in the rain, listening to the engines breathe, waiting for the next tank to arrive so I can open its hull and crawl inside and pretend that the darkness there is no different than the darkness in my chest. This is my confession. This is my testimony. This is the crushing reality of being a tank mechanic under fire. Not the shells or the mud or the cold, but the knowledge that you survive by becoming the very machine you service, and that survival is not victory but simply the continuation of function in the absence of purpose. The Emperor protects, they say. But in the pit, I learned the truth. The Emperor demands, and we comply, and the protection extends only as far as our usefulness. Beyond that lies only the dark and the rain and the sound of engines that breathe in the night. I am done now. The words are expelled. The infection is lanced. But the wound remains, and it will never heal. And I will carry it until my body is recycled, and my name is forgotten, and all that remains is the legacy of my work. Tanks that run, crews that die, and the endless cycle of repair and destruction that defines the Imperium's war machine. This is what I learned. This is what I became. This is what remains when everything else is stripped away. Oil and blood and the memory of breathing engines, eternal and unforgiving as the cold stars themselves.